I survived the crash that took my family, but I wish I hadn't. You never think it's going to happen to you. The kind of life-altering tragedy that you read about or see on the news, but always assume happens to someone else far away. I used to think that too. That was before everything changed in a single moment. Before I became the only one left. It's been almost 10 years since the crash that killed my family. I was 16 then, but sometimes, when I close my eyes and think about it, it feels like it happened yesterday. There are days when I can still hear the sounds of that night. The screech of tires, the crunch of metal, the silence that followed. It's a silence that stayed with me ever since. But before that night, my life was as normal as it gets. I grew up in a quiet suburban town. The kind of place where people still leave their doors unlocked during the day, and everyone knows each other by name. It was the four of us: my mom, dad, younger brother, and me. We weren't the perfect family by any means, but we were close. My parents both worked steady jobs, and my brother in Avencourlas was the kind of kid who got on my nerves like any younger sibling, but who I secretly adored. We spent weekends together, playing board games or going on small trips. Looking back, it all seems so ordinary, so safe. The day of the crash was just like any other. We had spent the weekend at a cabin by the lake, something my parents loved to do a few times a year. It was supposed to be one of those short family trips to get away from the routine. But we all knew what that really meant. No Wi-Fi, no TV, just us in a tiny cabin playing cards and roasting marshmallows. At 16, I wasn't exactly thrilled, but I went along with it. I could tell my mom wanted us all together, and if I'm being honest, I liked the break from everything too. The weekend had been nice, actually. We spent time kayaking, hiking, and for once there were no real arguments. Even Evan, who was 12 and in that irritating phase where he wouldn't stop asking a million questions, was bearable. I remember him asking me all about high school, what it was like, and whether it was true that kids got shoved into lockers. I rolled my eyes at the time, but I kind of miss those questions now. The crash happened on the drive back home. It was late afternoon, and the sun was starting to set. We were all tired, ready to get back to our lives. Evan and I had been bickering over the radio. He wanted to listen to some pop song he was obsessed with, and I was in no mood to deal with his whining. Typical sibling stuff. My dad, who was driving, finally gave in and told me to just let Evan have his way, so I did. I put my headphones on and tuned out. That's one of the last things I remember clearly before the accident. The next thing I remember is the sound of my mom screaming, and then everything happened at once. There was this horrible screeching, the kind that makes your whole body tense up. I yanked off my headphones just in time to see the blur of another car swerving into our lane. My dad's hands jerked the wheel to the right, but it was too late. The impact was deafening, a loud, crunching sound that still plays in my nightmares, over and over. Then, everything went black. I woke up in the hospital, disoriented and confused. I remember blinking against the harsh fluorescent lights, the sterile smell of disinfectant filling the air. At first, I couldn't understand where I was or why I was there. My body hurt everywhere. Sharp pains radiated through my chest and legs, my head throbbing in sync with my heartbeat. I tried to move, but something was wrong. It was like my limbs weren't listening to me. It took a while for the memories to come back. The crash, the blur of the other car, my dad's panicked voice yelling something I couldn't quite make out. I remember feeling a strange calm at first, like the world had gone completely quiet after the chaos. I didn't know it at the time, but that calm was the beginning of the worst news I'd ever hear. A nurse came in not long after I woke up. Her face was soft and concerned, but it was the kind of concern that made me uneasy. She asked me a few questions, how I was feeling, if I knew where I was. I answered in a fog, still trying to piece things together. I asked about my family, where they were, if they were okay. The nurse hesitated for just a second before telling me the doctors would be in soon to talk to me. That hesitation. I think about that moment a lot, how in just a second, everything changed. It's like my mind knew before I could fully register it. There was something she wasn't saying, something awful. The doctors came in not long after, but I barely remember what they said. Just fragments, pieces of sentences that made my heart drop. My dad had died on impact. My mom and Evan had been critically injured, but they hadn't made it through the night. I was the only one who survived. I don't know how long I stayed silent after they told me. I remember feeling like I was floating outside my body, watching this all unfold from somewhere far away. My family was gone. All of them. And I was here, alive, without them. I didn't cry at first. I just lay there, staring at the ceiling, listening to the distant hum of hospital machines. My mind couldn't process it. How could it? Just a few hours ago, we were all in the car together, fighting over music and complaining about the drive. And now, it was just me. The days after that were a blur. I remember people visiting me in the hospital, relatives I hadn't seen in years, their faces a mix of grief and pity. I hated that look in their eyes, the way they tiptoed around me like I was made of glass. Some of them cried, which made me feel even worse. I didn't cry, though. Not then. It was like I couldn't. I just felt empty. People kept telling me how lucky I was to have survived. They said it like it was supposed to make me feel better, like it was something to be grateful for. But I didn't feel lucky. I felt guilty. Why had I survived? Why me, and not them? I was the one who had been ignoring my brother, the one who'd been too wrapped up in my headphones to notice the danger. It didn't make sense. None of it did. They had the funeral a few days after I was released from the hospital. I didn't want to go, but I didn't have a choice. It was a small service, just family and a few close friends. I don't remember much of it. I was still in shock, I think. People came up to me, hugged me, told me how sorry they were. I just nodded, going through the motions, wishing I could disappear. What I remember most from that day is standing by their graves, looking at the headstones with their names etched into the marble. It felt surreal, like it wasn't really happening. I kept waiting to wake up from the nightmare, but the longer I stood there, the more real it became. I was alone. And that's when it hit me. The weight of it all, the loss, the guilt. That's when I finally broke down. In the weeks after the funeral, the real weight of everything began to settle in. I had left the hospital and moved in with my Aunt Karen, my mom's sister. She was kind, and I know she meant well, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was a burden to her. She didn't have kids of her own, and suddenly taking in a grief-stricken teenager couldn't have been easy. She tiptoed around me the same way everyone else did, careful with every word, as if I might shatter at any moment. At first, I was just numb. I went through the motions like a zombie. Eat, sleep, exist. But soon, the silence of it all became unbearable. My mind, which had been mercifully quiet in those early days, started to turn on me. At night, I would lie awake, replaying the crash over and over again. I'd see my dad's hands gripping the steering wheel, feel the sudden jolt of the impact, hear my mother scream. I'd relive that awful silence that followed, the one that stretched out like a void swallowing everything good and familiar. And then there were the dreams. They started a few weeks after I moved in with Aunt Karen. At first, they were just flashes, images of my family, still and lifeless, like they were frozen in time. I would see them sitting at the dinner table, but their faces were blank, and no one was talking. In some dreams, I was back in the car, except this time I knew what was coming. I would try to warn them, scream at my dad to brake, but my voice wouldn't work, and the car would careen off the road every time, ending in the same awful crash. But as time went on, the dreams became more vivid, more unsettling. One night, I dreamt that I was back at our old house. It was just as I remembered it, warm, cozy, with the smell of my mom's cooking in the air. For a brief, fleeting moment, everything felt normal. I could hear Evan's voice in the other room, and I almost convinced myself that this was real, that the crash had never happened. But when I went into the living room, my family was sitting there, still and unmoving, their eyes fixed on me. My mom's face twisted into something unrecognizable, her lips moving, but no sound coming out. Evan sat next to her, staring straight ahead, his face pale. I woke up drenched in sweat, my heart pounding in my chest. I brushed it off at first, telling myself that it was just my brain processing the trauma, trying to make sense of everything. But the dreams kept coming. Each night, they grew more intense, more detailed, as if my family was trying to tell me something. I started waking up multiple times a night, gasping for air, feeling like I'd just escaped some terrible reality. But the worst part wasn't the dreams themselves. It was the feeling that lingered when I woke up. This creeping sense that my family wasn't gone, not really. It was irrational, but it gnawed at me, growing stronger with each passing day. During the day, I would try to push it aside, focus on getting back to some semblance of a routine. I went back to school, though it didn't feel like school anymore. Everything had changed. The hallways, once filled with noise and laughter, now seemed quiet, almost hollow. My friends didn't know how to talk to me anymore. They offered their condolences, but after a while, they stopped trying. I don't blame them. I didn't know how to talk to them, either. What do you say to someone when you feel like you don't even belong in the world anymore? The isolation only made the nights worse. I dreaded going to bed, because I knew what was waiting for me. The same dreams, the same eerie stillness, and that same suffocating guilt. I started to wonder if it was more than just dreams, more than just my subconscious playing tricks on me. I couldn't shake the feeling that my family was there, just out of reach, trying to communicate with me. It sounded ridiculous, even in my own head, but it didn't feel ridiculous. It felt real. One night, everything changed. I had been lying in bed for hours, unable to sleep, staring at the ceiling and waiting for the inevitable. The house was completely still. Aunt Karen had gone to bed hours ago, and the only sound was the occasional creak of the old floorboards. As I lay there, I thought I heard something. A faint sound, like someone whispering. I sat up, straining to listen, but the sound faded. My heart raced, and I told myself it was just my imagination, just the remnants of my nightmares leaking into my waking life. But then I heard it again. This time, it was clearer. A soft voice, just barely audible, calling my name. It wasn't Aunt Karen. This voice was too familiar. Too wrong. I felt a chill run down my spine, and I sat frozen, unable to move. The voice called my name again, louder this time, and I realized with a sickening jolt that it sounded like my mom. I forced myself to get out of bed, my legs trembling as I made my way down the hallway. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest, but I had to know. I had to see if there was something there, even if it was just my own mind playing tricks on me. When I reached the living room, the house was still dark, but I could feel something. An energy. A presence. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up as I slowly looked around. And then I saw it. In the faint light from the street lamp outside, I could make out the silhouette of someone standing by the window. I blinked, my breath catching in my throat, because I recognized that silhouette. It was my mom. She was standing there, just like in my dreams, staring out the window, unmoving. I couldn't speak. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. I wanted to run, to scream, but I couldn't. My legs felt like lead. All I could do was watch as the figure slowly turned towards me. It wasn't my mom. It looked like her, but her face was wrong, twisted, pale and distorted, like the version of her from my dreams. Her eyes were wide, her mouth slightly open as if she was trying to speak, but no sound came out. I stumbled backward, my heart hammering in my chest, and as I did, the figure vanished. Gone, just like that. The room was empty again, and I was standing there, shaking, alone. I ran back to my room and locked the door, my mind racing. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. I sat in bed, staring at the door, waiting for something, anything to happen. But nothing did. The next morning, I tried to convince myself it had been a dream, just my mind playing tricks on me again. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. I knew what I'd seen, and I couldn't shake the feeling that my family was still here, lingering, in some way, I couldn't explain. I didn't tell Aunt Karen. I couldn't. How do you tell someone that you think your dead family is haunting you? That you can hear their voices and see their faces in the dark corners of the house? I knew she wouldn't believe me. Hell, I barely believed it myself. But from that night on, I started to feel like I wasn't alone. Even in the daylight, I could sense it. This heaviness in the air, like something was always watching me, waiting. And I couldn't help but wonder, what if they never really left? What if I wasn't meant to survive after all? In the days after seeing my mom's distorted figure by the window, I became obsessed with finding answers. I couldn't shake the feeling that my family was still with me, in some twisted way, whether it was real or just my mind playing tricks on me. I didn't know, but I needed to understand. I needed to know why I was seeing them, why I could still hear their voices in the quiet moments when I was alone. I stopped sleeping. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw them. My family, standing still, waiting. Their faces were twisted, but they weren't angry. It was more like they were trapped. I could feel their sadness, their desperation, and it became unbearable. I didn't want to sleep anymore. I didn't want to dream, because in those dreams, I was reminded of what I had lost, and what I had somehow, inexplicably, survived. I started researching, looking for explanations that went beyond trauma. I read articles on grief, psychological manifestations of loss, survivors' guilt, anything that might explain why I was seeing and hearing things that couldn't possibly be real. But none of the answers felt right. The logic, the science, it didn't comfort me. It didn't stop the nightmares, and it didn't explain the overwhelming sense that my family was somehow here. Aunt Karen noticed the change in me, of course. She'd grown used to the quiet, withdrawn version of me after the crash, but now I could see the worry in her eyes. I didn't blame her. I wasn't eating much, barely speaking, and the dark circles under my eyes were a dead giveaway that I hadn't slept in days. She tried to ask if I was okay, if I wanted to talk, but I just shrugged her off. What could I say? That I thought my family was haunting me. That their faces haunted me every time I closed my eyes. No one could help me. I had to figure it out on my own. One night the feeling became too much to bear. The house was too quiet, too still. The air felt heavy, like it was pressing down on my chest, and I could sense that something was waiting for me. I couldn't stay in my room anymore. I felt suffocated. I needed answers. I grabbed my jacket and left the house, walking aimlessly through the neighborhood. The night was cold, the streets empty, but I didn't care. My feet moved without direction, my mind racing. I wandered for what felt like hours, but no matter where I went, the sense of dread followed me. It was as if I couldn't escape the weight of their presence. Eventually, I found myself standing at the edge of a bridge. It wasn't far from Aunt Karen's house, just a few blocks away, overlooking a small river that cut through the town. I had crossed it 1,000 times before, but tonight, it felt different. There was something about the way the water moved beneath me, dark and silent, that pulled me in. I walked to the middle of the bridge and leaned over the railing, staring down at the water below. My breath came out in shaky clouds in the cold air, and for a moment, I felt calm. It was the first time in weeks that I hadn't felt the crushing weight of grief and guilt pressing down on me. But then I heard it. A voice. It was faint at first, almost drowned out by the wind, but I knew that voice anywhere. It was my brother, Evan, calling my name. I froze, gripping the railing, my heart pounding in my chest. I told myself it wasn't real. I told myself it was just another trick of my mind. But the voice came again, clearer this time, and I could hear the desperation in it. It wasn't angry, wasn't accusing, it was just there, like a plea, like he needed me. I turned slowly, my eyes scanning the empty bridge. Of course, no one was there. I was alone, but the voice didn't stop. It kept calling, soft but insistent, pulling at something deep inside me. For the first time, I didn't feel afraid. I just felt an overwhelming sense of sadness. "Evan?" I whispered into the night, my voice trembling. "Is that you?" There was no answer, but the air felt thicker, heavier. It was like the world had paused, like I was standing in a bubble of silence, cut off from everything else. "I'm sorry," I whispered. My voice cracked as I spoke, and I felt the tears burning behind my eyes. "I'm so sorry. I should have been the one. I shouldn't have survived." I waited, expecting, hoping for some kind of response, but there was only silence. And that's when I realized something. It wasn't my family that was haunting me. It wasn't their twisted faces or their trapped voices that were holding me captive. It was me. I had been the one keeping them there, in my mind, in my heart. I had refused to let them go, clinging to the guilt, the what-ifs, the sense that I had somehow cheated death. I had been so consumed by my own survival that I had trapped myself in this endless loop of blame and regret. The voices, the visions, they weren't my family trying to reach me. They were my own mind, desperately trying to make sense of a tragedy that had no reason, no explanation. I stood there for a long time, staring out into the darkness, letting the cold air bite at my skin, and for the first time since the crash, I let myself cry. Really cry. Not just tears of guilt, but tears of grief. I let the weight of their loss wash over me, not as a punishment, but as a part of me. Something I would carry, but not something that would destroy me. I still don't know why I survived. I don't know why fate or chance or whatever it was spared me, and not them. But standing there on that bridge, I realized that I wasn't going to find answers. Not like that. My family was gone, and I couldn't change that. But I was still here, still alive. And that had to mean something. It's been years since that night, and while I still think about them every day, the haunting presence is gone. I've learned to live with the grief, the loss. It never goes away, not completely, but it changes. It becomes a part of you, like a scar that fades with time but never fully disappears. Sometimes I still hear Evan's voice in my dreams, and sometimes I catch glimpses of my mom or dad in the corners of my mind. But now, instead of fear, I feel a strange kind of peace. They're not haunting me anymore. They're just memories, pieces of the life I had before. And I've learned that it's okay to carry them with me. Surviving isn't easy and it's not always a blessing, but it's something, and for now that's enough.